again, integrity. It may help. Remember, on the integrity files, you don't have to play the whole thing. If they're just part of it that you want to review, and it's just there as a tool. So, well, we're not worried in Aristotle about intellectual virtues, but the point about these two types of virtue, though, is they're both areas where we can exercise our reasoning abilities, our rational abilities. And of course, Aristotle was controversial. I think your book goes into this a little bit. I don't like to stress it. But there are problems with making reasoning or rationality the standard for our humanness. Not just in Aristotle's time, but this crops up even in contemporary medical ethics, for instance. If rationality is going to be your standard for what constitutes a human being, does that mean that newly born infants, before they learn a language, before they can reason rationally, are something less than fully human? There are people who advocate that. One of whom is Richard Rorty at the University of Virginia, where I was at. Is somebody less than human if they don't have full intellectual capacity? When I was in college, there was an ethicist and theologian who wrote a book called Situation Ethics. And that was the big deal. The idea is you can do whatever you like as long as you do it in love. This is the 60s love generation, right? But the point is, what was his last name? I think it was Fraser. He became a medical ethicist at the University of Virginia. And I used to go into some issues in medical ethics, and one of the things that he advocated was that, say, a child with Down syndrome was something less than fully human, because he used the standard of rationality. And that's a pretty controversial view nowadays. So Aristotle did want to attach our humanness to our reasoning abilities. And we exercise them in learning more about the world around us, intellectual virtues. But what we concentrated on is moral virtues. And again, I see virtue ethics as a complement to the type of ethics we're going to look at later, what are called theories about obligation. In other words, you can have all the moral principles in the world. This is what the guy who ran the Hofberger Center for Applied Ethics down at the University of Baltimore, Fred Guy, used to say to his students. He said, you can have all the moral principles in the world, but if you don't have the strength of character to stand by those principles, what does it matter? And so, virtue ethics is a complement. On the other hand, if you just look at virtue ethics, the point made in the video is without some kind of principled ethics, then you're wide open to relativism, because what counts as a virtue in one society may differ from another. So moral virtues, then, is what we're more interested in from Aristotle. And Aristotle, like Socrates and Plato before him, is more concerned with virtuous character traits. And of course, Aristotle's claim is that we acquire these by habit. Remember, for Aristotle, there is no independently existing form of the good. So the goal of ethics can't be meditating or trying to imitate goodness itself with a capital G, like Plato had, but it's more in, for Aristotle, seeking eudaimonia, which is translated happiness, but for the Greeks had a wider meaning. It's kind of a well-being. Well, often, to develop virtuous character traits, we have to go contrary to our nature. In other words, if I'm working on temperance, I might want to have that second or third piece of apple pie, and I got to work against the tendency to do that, you know. Or if I'm working to be more courageous, I might not want to go in there and talk to my boss for a raise, or talk to that, client out there who's having a customer service issue, and I'd rather not talk to them, we have to work against our nature often too. So we acquire the virtues by exercising them, and as I said, it's kind of a full circle thing. In other words, we do virtuous actions. I had a diagram on the board, and making those choices over a period of time enables us to develop virtues. But after having developed them, it's easier for us to act in accordance with them. If we've developed self-control, easier for us to exercise self-control. If we've developed courage, easier for us to be courageous. It's like playing a musical instrument. All you have to do is look at the ends of my left fingers, and you'll see how much I play the guitar anymore. There are no calluses there at all. And yet, if somebody stuck a guitar in my hand, I could still, play a lot of songs just from memory. Would hurt my fingers after a while. But in other words, once you acquire those skills, you can still exercise them. This is kind of Aristotle's point. So we don't acquire virtuous character traits by going off and meditating on the form of the good, but it's by exercising our judgment to make the right choices, and also in society. So it's analogous to other skills like learning a trade or playing a musical instrument. And Aristotle is a very social guy. He's not an isolated philosopher. He realizes that, if you're trying to develop courage, you may have to exercise your judgment and make the courageous decisions in your interactions with other people. So the moral virtues are social, and we don't become morally just in isolation, just private meditation. But in our transactions with others. So I put some, let's say, this is from the PowerPoint, but we saw that for him a virtue is following the moderate ground. It's always the midway point between two vices, one a vice of deprivation, the other a vice of excess. So that model that you see down at the bottom of this slide is pretty much, I mean, this is like the model of a virtue for Aristotle. And a lot of this was culturally driven. I mean, the Greeks emphasized moderation and following what they called the golden mean. And Aristotle is just kind of thinking about this in a more detailed way philosophically. But he's on board with his society here. So you can see how temperance can be the mean between asceticism, that is the denial of the needs of our body, and overindulgence, gluttony or drunkenness. Courage, the mean between cowardice, fearing everything, and foolhardiness, fearing nothing. But, you know, it's feeling fear but controlling it. And, you know, I mean, a lot of athletes say, hey, you know, they get sweaty palms before the big game. You know, probably some, you know, athletes from Kansas and the Giants who have some sweaty palms today, you know. Now, we wish that it was some Orioles who had sweaty palms, but I mean, some of us are old enough to remember the 1966 World Series, and I know, you know, you weren't even a gleam in your parents' eye back then, but yeah, it was amazing. We had 420-game winning pitchers then, and we just beat up on the Dodgers. Well, anyway, and that sort of started a string where the Orioles did well for years after that. So we achieve the mean then using our reason. You know, this is where reason comes into play, that we make decisions by our reason and not by our emotions. And you know, here again is how Aristotle defends the claim that it's our rationing abilities that makes us unique as human beings. The essential nature of something for Aristotle is usually defined in terms of its function. In other words, a knife, you know, it's is there to cut things, you know, and you know, so we define it in terms of its function. And so, you know, what's unique to us? Well, for Aristotle, it's reasoning, right? Plants have biological functions. So do non-human animals. So that can't be anything unique to human beings. And while plants have an emotional life only in science fiction, we share with non-human animals the ability to feel pain and awareness of our surroundings, things having to do with what is called sentience, or having a sentient nature. So Aristotle says that can't be what's unique to us. Then he says it must be our rational abilities, the ability to follow a train of reasoning, and to have abstract concepts. You know, again, after Darwin, you know, the thought is that the line between us and non-human animals is only a difference of degree, not of kind. whereas for Aristotle, reasoning is different in kind than anything non-human animals have. Even border collies, right? Seen those bumper stickers, my border collie is smarter than your honor student, you know. So not even border collies have these abilities for Aristotle. So the point is, if our unique characteristic defines what we are, our essential nature, then we're essentially reasoning beings. Now, happiness, the way Aristotle establishes happiness as the goal of morality is to say that what you want as the prime good, as the chief good, in other words, he defines moral goodness in terms of the promotion of eudaimonia, or happiness. What you want for your chief good is something that's good in itself, not good just because it promotes some other good. The technical terms that I'm not going to ask you are something that's good in itself is intrinsically good. You can even see the word in. Whereas something that is only good because it promotes some other good, sometimes it's called extrinsically good, but more often instrumentally good. In other words, it's only an instrument leading to some other good. And I gave you that example that I have in my ethics, had in one of my ethics texts. You know, it's good to eat healthy foods, and you say, well, why? Well, because it'll make you healthier. And so you say, well, why is it good to be healthy? Well, you know, people who are healthier, not only do they live longer, but they have happier, more satisfying lives. But then if you go on to ask, well, why is it good to be happy? For Aristotle, the buck stops there. You're not pursuing eudaimonia or happiness to promote some other good, but for its own sake. You know, so happiness for him is activity in accordance with virtue. In other words, his argument is that the virtuous life will also be the happiest one for us as human beings. The cliche that is still used is virtue is its own reward. So happiness then, again, something desirable for its own sake and not for the sake of something else. Virtue, he defines then as happiness is activity in accordance with virtue. So if we're making these decisions that, lead to the golden mean, a moderate life, we're going to have the happiest life for him. And of course, this is not what is sold, right? I mean, often what's sold in the media is that the happiest life is some life where somebody's pushing the envelope, going to extremes. For the Greeks, it was something different than that. So, again, a life of moderation, which, so virtue is walking that moderate mean between extremes. And how do we do it? Well, we use our reason to control our lower nature. And this is very similar to what Plato was arguing. Remember the three parts of the soul, and that reason should control the appetitive element, and that produces self-control or temperance. Reason should control the emotions, the spirited element for Plato. Aristotle apparently bought into the same threefold distinction. So the happy life is the moderate life. Now, that is something that we've already done. We just did this. I'm going to back up for a minute. So remember, a priori, if you see the root word prior to and independent of experience. So an a priori argument is an argument that goes from concepts alone, not from any observations about the world. And that's the kind of argument that you find in the ontological argument. Remember, we saw this type of argument first way back with Parmenides, and his arguing from concepts that there's no change, right? So here we get an argument from concepts alone for the existence of God. And so now there are some other a priori arguments from God. One that Descartes uses besides the ontological argument is that he says, hey, I've got this idea of God implanted in my soul. He thinks it's innate. And he says, well, this is a perfect idea. I'm nothing but a poor sinner. I couldn't have generated this perfect idea. It didn't come from anybody around me, from society, because they're imperfect too. It didn't come from nothing, because you can't get something from nothing. Where did this perfect idea of God come from, says Descartes? Well, it must have had only one possible cause, a cause sufficient to produce the effect, namely God himself. So now I'm not going to ask you about that, but that's another a priori argument from God that goes from our concept of God to the claim that the only way we can have that concept is if it originated with God himself. Another kind of Platonic argument. So the ontological argument is not the only a priori argument from God, but it's probably the most famous. Well, we didn't do too much on cosmological arguments, but it's good to know what they are, right? Arguments that the cosmos needed a necessary first cause to bring it into existence. Aquinas' first three ways are versions of this. In contemporary thought, the Big Bang theory is relevant to cosmological arguments. Was God the cause of the Big Bang? Well, but the ones we concentrated on were the ontological argument and the design argument. The telos is an end or goal or purpose, and the design argument revolves around the fact that if things in nature fulfill a purpose, they must have been designed to do so. So ontological argument comes from hoantos, the Greek word for existence or being. And the concept of God's being, of course, is that God is that than which none greater can be thought, the greatest being we can think of. Now, why must the greatest being exist in reality? Well, here we get a Platonic assumption sneaked into the argument, right? Plato's view that if something is greater, it has a greater existence status, right? To be less than good is to be less than real, but if something is better, it has more reality. So the idea is something has less reality is not as great if it exists only as a concept in the mind, right? The painting, the concept of the painting isn't as great as the painting itself. So we have this Platonic assumption that if something's greater, it has to have more existence. Well, the greatest thing we imagine has then to exist in order to count as the greatest thing. And so if we talk about the concept, the greatest being we can imagine, and then we go on to say with the fool that that being exists only in the mind, then Anselm would say, yeah, but the concept you got is not of the greatest being. Because the only greatest being I know exists in reality, not just in the mind. So whatever you have a concept of, if it's if that greatest being doesn't exist in reality, you don't have a concept of the greatest being you can imagine. So then the greatest being imaginable has to exist in reality in order to qualify as the greatest being. Well, so basically you're buying into the existence of God by buying into the concept of God as the greatest being. And this is what leads the denier of God, the fool, right? The fool has said in his heart, there is no God, from the Psalms. This is what leads the fool into contradictions. If the fool says, well, okay, I'll agree with you, Anselm, that if there were a God, God would be the greatest being we can imagine. But I don't think that God exists in reality, only as a concept. And Anselm would say, well, wait a second, in order to be the greatest being imaginable, he's got to exist in reality. So you can't, on the one hand, claim that you've got a concept of the greatest being imaginable and then deny the existence of that being in reality. You're contradicting yourself. And this is the general characteristic, by the way, of a deductive argument, that it's so airtight that to accept the premises and deny the conclusion leads to an outright contradiction. But that's a subtle point of logic that we're not going to require of you, okay? So we went over who the fool is, why it can't be just a concept. So that's the argument. And again, a way to kind of self-test yourself, do I really understand this argument, for both forms of it, is to try to, even if you don't answer the essay question, let's see. Even if you don't answer question 5, at least try to say, okay, how does this contradiction arise for both forms of the argument? And if you can explain to yourself or your roommate, or your significant other at home, then you probably have it down. So the stock historical objection comes from his fellow monk Guanillo, Anselm's fellow monk. And we call this refutation by logical analogy. basically, Guanillo says, wait a second, Anselm. If you're now remember, the claim here isn't that anything we can conceive must exist. You don't want to get them confused with Parmenides. But it's the Platonic point that in order to be the greatest, something has to exist to be the greatest. And so Guanillo says, wait a second, we can apply, perfection and the greatest to a lot of other things than God. What about the greatest island there, Anselm? Suppose I make an argument that the greatest possible island I can conceive of has to exist in reality, or it wouldn't be the greatest island I can conceive of. Doesn't that somehow prove from mere concepts that that island must be out there somewhere? But does it seem like we should be able to do that? Prove from mere thought alone that that island is there? So, Anselm, if there's something wrong with my being able to prove that the most perfect island exists just from that concept, you know what, buddy? There must be something wrong with your trying to prove God exists just from the concept of God as the greatest being. And so, I mean, I'm trying to sort of paraphrase Anselm, not Anselm's, but Guanillo's objection to Anselm. Now, again, I think my own feeling is if you've got this Platonic assumption buried in there, that in order to be the greatest, you got to exist in reality, then I don't think Anselm has a good reply to this argument. Now, if you try to attach God's existence to necessity, to necessary existence, as Descartes does and as the 20th century version of this argument does, then I think you might be on better ground. But this is just a reflection on it. But some people think that he never came up with a good counter to it because he realized that he can't. The best that Anselm does is to say the case of God must be unique. But if you're going to buy into that Platonic premise that to be the greatest you got to exist in reality, then I don't think it works to say the greatest, the case of God must be unique. If you're buying into the concept of necessary versus contingent existence and saying that there's only one self-sufficiently necessary being, then maybe you got it. So at any rate, so similar reasoning would prove the existence of the most perfect island. Why is this a problem for the ontological argument? Namely, you're using the same reasoning in both. Okay. Well, Descartes uses a slightly different concept of God. That is that God is the sum of all perfections. God is the supremely perfect being, possesses all perfect qualities. Existence being one of those perfections, one of those qualities. So the quality claims is also part of God's attributes as existence. But then we saw that if you make existence as a quality that we can predicate of a thing, remember, if I say my briefcase is black, I'm predicating that color. I'm predicating the quality of blackness of my briefcase. If I say this jacket is soft or this jacket is warm, I'm predicating those qualities of the jacket. And so likewise, when we say God is omniscient, God is omnipotent, we're predicating those qualities of omniscience, God knows everything, omnipotence, God is all-powerful, of God. And so if we say God is an existing being, we're also predicating existence of God. But the point that Kant makes is you don't add anything to the description of a thing to say it exists. It's not like saying one of the qualities my car has is that it's blue. To say another quality it has is that it exists doesn't do it for Kant. And so Kant's stock criticism of Descartes' approach is that existence is not a quality. But it's putting existence in the list that gives rise to the contradiction in the case of the fool. Because if the fool says, okay, Descartes, I don't think God's around, but I'll give you the assumption that if God were around, God would be the supremely perfect being. And Descartes says, well, you know what? Existence is as important to God's description as having three angles is to a triangle. So if you bought into God as a supremely perfect being, you've also bought into the concept that that God exists. So it would be a contradiction for you, on the one hand, to buy into that concept, admit God would be the supremely perfect being, and then on the other hand, deny existence to God. Because in buying into the concept of God as a supremely perfect being, you bought into God's existence. You know, that's how the contradiction arises there. Well, okay. So at any rate, the point is, if we take existence out of that list, then we can consistently deny existence to God without contradicting ourselves. And that means that the ontological argument does not work in that form. And this is Kant's point, that existence functions differently. Again, the 20th century version of the ontological argument treats existence like Kant does. And it goes from God, from the premise, it is possible that at least one necessary being exists. And in about half a dozen steps, you have the proof of the claim that it's necessary that a necessary being exists. In other words, that it's not possible that a necessary being does not exist. You know, therefore God must exist as a necessary being. And that does not treat existence the way Descartes does it, as a logical predicate. What aroused new interest in this argument is the fact that the 20th century version of it gets around Kant's objection to Descartes because it treats existence just like Kant did, but it still generates the ontological argument. Well, are there any other? I mean, we did the design argument fairly recently. I mean, are there any directions you'd like me to go with that? Or, I mean, would it help to briefly cover what's on this? I don't know. Or, are there any questions? Can you know, Well, again, you want to make sure you understand how a goal or purpose fits into the teleological arguments, that's why they're named what they're named. Now, again, basically Hume's criticisms of the design. Look, I don't have anything on. Okay, this is an alert. I don't have anything on Paley, but I think Paley's pretty easy to understand on his own. Somehow I just never. I should get some points and put them in a review sheet, But you can see how Paley's analogy goes, right? What made the watch different from the stone? Well, in the watch we have, unlike the stone, we have a lot of moving parts that work together to enable the watch to serve a particular purpose. And so you can say, well, wait a second, in some of the things we find in nature, like the eye, you have a lot of moving parts working together to serve a purpose. So those are the similarities for the argument from analogy, and then you say, but wait a second, the watch didn't just get there in the field by itself. Somebody had to design and build it to serve that purpose, telling time. So then the analogy goes, well, if something like the eye is so similar to the watch in some respects, like having parts that work together to fulfill a purpose, then something like the eye needed an intelligence behind it, an intelligent designer. Hume's basic criticisms of the argument is that the analogy is bad because it compares the universe itself to manufactured items, and do we know that the universe had to have been designed? Are there other possible causes of order? Well, Hume says if there are, then you can't conclude from the order in the universe that the only possible cause of that order is intelligent design. There are other possibilities. Maybe some internal principle of matter works toward organization and design. Now, Paley criticizes Hume on this. Paley read Hume, and he says, you want to say there's some principle of order that produced the watch, or if you did, I would reply that I don't know what you mean by principle of order. I don't have a clear concept of what you're claiming is a possibility here, as opposed to intelligent design, says Paley. But then modern evolutionary theory says, well, okay, you can get more complex organisms over time through chance as a purely random process and natural selection, selecting the best eyes or the mutations, the adaptations, the creatures with better eyes that adapted to their environment. By those being selected over time, some internal principle of matter, chance and natural selection works toward a more and more complex eye, and so we don't need direct design. That's the counter argument from the evolutionists. As I said, my problem with evolution isn't after you get all organisms, so sophisticated that you get, reproduction, natural selection going, and adaptations. My problem goes way back. How do you get to first cell? how do you get her cell to work? You know, I read a book when I was in high school called Human Destiny by Lecompte, who was a scientist. And he worked out the mathematical probabilities of getting even one cell by mere chance, and they're astronomical. You know, and that's one of the reasons, you know, why I have a bit of a problem with evolution as a totally random process from the beginning. However, I think there definitely organisms adapt to their environment. I don't think the Earth is 6,000 years old. You have to distinguish intelligent design from the young Earth theory. You know, from the claim that in order to think God created the world has to be 6,000 years old. You don't have to buy both of those concepts, or none of them. You know, there are ways, you know, around it. Okay, assume that I will have scantrons for you. I'm going to dig in the archives here. You know, because they're not providing me with any. So bring a number 2 pencil. I'll have some. I should have some if I can remember to put them back in. So, and again, remember to put the number of the actual question on your, you know, your question somewhere. If you do question 6, put 6. Don't put a 2 because this is the second essay you're doing. That confuses me. I don't know what to do. It says 6, but it's really 6. No, I can figure it out, but I'd rather not figure it out. All right, look, if anybody didn't get on a roll, let me know on your way out. And if you need a question pool, print out, there are some up here. You know, again, so take care. We'll see you Thursday. And if you have a question that comes